This is video number 86, and the title is Baiting Big Game. This story will be a collage of many of the baiting cases we had over the years. You may be surprised and perhaps amused by some of these experiences. In Pennsylvania, the law around baiting read like this: all food and all residue placed for feeding game must be totally removed 30 days prior to the season. Bear season was always Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday before Thanksgiving. Another deputy who was part of our crew rented Steve, who owned the Tunkhannock Airport, and his plane each Friday before bear season. We did this for 5 or 6 years. Looking down from above into the November woods, a pickup load of cob corn looked just like a gold beacon. Steve's plane was a two-seater with the storage space behind the 2 seats. Of course, Steve would pilot in the left seat, and Dick would take notes in the other seat. I would be in the back area where there was a large window on each side. I was armed with my video camera. Every year we would find 3 to 5 bait piles. To get a good view, I would have Steve make a laid-over turn so I could film almost straight down. We followed the road or trail from the pile to its origin, not only so we could figure how to go in, but in court you have to establish location. There were many, so I'll relate them in no particular order. The first was about a half-mile west of Evans Falls Elementary School in the Root Hollow area. There was a hunting cabin with a large pile of corn pretty close to the cabin. Come Monday morning, Ed, the salaried officer from Bradford County, temporarily assigned to Wyoming County as well, picked up Daisy and myself, and we headed to that site. We found the access road that went through the woods. The cabin owners had conveniently placed a log across the road. Daisy and Ed went in on foot to catch them off guard. I stayed back and removed the log. I then slowly drove the Game Commission vehicle into the camp. One of the hunters actually commented as to how did we get in there with a log across the road. Too bad. They had removed most of the corn since Friday's flyover. But as above, the law says residue. They never get it all. We just took a Ziploc bag and picked up chunks of corn and deer and bear droppings for evidence. Then the group was cited for hunting bear over bait. The fine was $800 each. There were some court repercussions for one of the defendants. I won't relate that here, as locals would know who was involved. There were a number of cases on Dutch Mountain. One cabin had a huge pile of pumpkins and cabbage behind their cabin. It was out in the open, not even in the woods. They had killed 3 deer. The fine for deer was $500 for each deer, and applied to each person in the camp. There were 3 hunters in that incident. Corn was the most common bait, but not always. One short-time salaried officer we had was assigned a trainee from the current class of conservation officers at the Ross Leffer School at the Game Commission headquarters in Harrisburg. There was a report of baiting at a cabin where we never had a problem before. The trainee and I went to investigate. There was no one at the camp while we were there. It was a well-kept camp. The building was in fine repair and the lawn was manicured. A better-class cabin for sure. The trainee and I walked around the property and through the woods for about an hour. I knew who had dropped a dime about the baiting, so I was very sure it was there. I just happened to look over at a tree stump near the outer edge of the yard. The coloration was off. When we checked it out, someone had used a saw and cut a notch down into that stump where they perfectly fit a cattle mineral block. Brown bark and brown mineral block, but not exactly alike. There is a valley in the western end of the county. The road into this private valley is a dead end. The cabin at the end had been baiting for a good while. They used apple pulp they acquired from an apple cider mill. They dumped this stuff right next to a cabin. The problem we had was that deer potted up so badly that when we randomly checked, all we found was mud. I thought about taking a shovelful and taking it to the crime lab for analysis, but we found that they would have a difficult time with that kind of testing, so I took pot luck. I heard that others were baiting in that valley as well. I had run-ins with the folks at the last cabin in the past, so I went in dressed in full uniform. That way they couldn't whine in court that I was trespassing if I was in plain clothes. This one particular time, I had Daisy drop me off and I had my handheld radio. I would contact Dallas and have them call her to pick me up after I had looked around some. There were 3 or 4 other cabins in that valley that I wanted to check out. The road in there was about a mile long, so it would take some time. Apparently someone saw her leaving in our truck and called the owner of the last cabin and alerted him that I was in the area. I had checked around the other cabins and was walking out the road when I heard a quad coming up the road. I was in a bad spot. I was right next to an open field that went down to the creek, and there was no place to hide. I had to think fast. The ditch was the only cover. I hopped off the road and laid down in the ditch face up. I heard the 4-wheeler quad go by, but he didn't go far and turned around. I was still in the ditch. He came back down the road and stopped. I just shifted my eyes to the right and I could see his boot. He stopped right next to me. I did not move. Next, he got off the quad and was standing right next to me. His boots were less than a foot away. I was laying there in full uniform with gold shoulder patches and bright silver badge and looking straight up at him. He had his binoculars trained on the valley. He was looking and scanning really slow. He was sure that darn game warden was around somewhere. As he lowered the binoculars, he made a turn back to the quad, got on and started up and drove away. I waited till I could no longer hear the quad and headed down the road and radioed Dallas to have Daisy pick me up. The cases we made through the use of the plane were always fun. The defendants had no idea that mustard-colored plane doing crazy turns and zigs and zags had 2 game wardens in it with a video camera. I guess I prosecuted 8 or maybe even 10 of these plane cases in magistrate court. When we made the bust, we never mentioned the flyover. They always got a lawyer and requested a hearing. Then it got to be fun. I enjoyed going head-to-head representing the state with the lawyer. Patty Robinson was the magistrate at the time for the area where almost all the baiting was being conducted. I would always make sure the defendant and his lawyer had gone into the office ahead of me. Patty had a 3-shelf TV and video stand in the courtroom. When she looked up and saw me coming into the room carrying my 19-inch portable TV and a VCR, she would just smile, knowing it was going to be short and sweet. It got to the point where I didn't even have to ask to use the stand. The last couple of times she positioned it for me. While setting up, I glanced at the defendant and the lawyer. The conversation was intense, and there was always waving hands and shrugging of shoulders. The last baiting case we had was the most interesting. It took place at a cabin just outside of Levelton. I got word from an informant about the baiting going on. It was pre-season once again. And this time I walked in from the west and about a half mile from the baiting site. I found it just as the informant had described. There was a mound of day-old pastries, large foot-square solid blocks of chocolate, and gallon jugs of surplus maple syrup nailed to the surrounding trees with drip holes in them. These guys were serious about it. This was before the time of trail cameras, but I always had my Polaroid handy. As I mentioned, it was pre-season. It was 3 or 4 weeks before the season. There were a few concerned folks close by who knew about it. They agreed to take note of when the white Jeep was in the area, and especially if it went up the access road from the cabin. I got lots of input, and I verified it as soon as I could. I would walk in and take note of the changes. More pastry layers, new chocolate blocks, and when the maple jugs were changed. The bears loved this spot would be an understatement. The trees with jugs nailed on were all clawed and the jugs were really chewed up. We didn't know for sure how many people would be involved. Roy, Daisy, Dick, and I had a planning meeting as to how we were going to handle this one. There was no way they could get rid of the evidence of this setup. Roy and Dick each made random drive-bys in their travels, but we never made an appearance or drove up the access road. We don't want to give ourselves away. Well, Monday came and we drove right up the road to the bait pile. On the way up there was a large pile of corn and salt on the west side of the road. When we got up there, we found two people, one in a complete orange jumpsuit and the other in a camo jacket and jeans. Both men had rifles. As we confronted these men, there was a rifle shot over on the next property. Roy went to check it out. I took the two hunters' pictures. The guy in the full orange, except a hat, didn't like it too much. The pile had been replenished and I took pictures. I forgot to bring a small tape measure. I found a small medication tube on the ground and placed it on a chocolate block for a size reference. I measured the tube when I got home. It was 4 inches long. That came into play at the hearing. The guy in orange denied knowing anything about the bait, even though he was only 20 feet from it. As we were checking licenses and ID, Roy came back escorting two more hunters. They had shot a bear about 500 yards away from our location. The bear had chocolate in its mouth. I issued citations to both of the first pair for hunting bear over bait, and the second one to the landowner for hunting without the required amount of orange. Also, they were advised of the right to a hearing and the option to settle on a field acknowledgement of guilt. I then turned my attention to the second two. Dick and Roy kept them separated and did some license and ID gathering. Daisy was backing me up. Now Roy and I separated the second two and proceeded to get into some more intense questioning. After about 10 or so minutes, Roy and I switched and spent a few more minutes questioning these two. The bear had been killed far enough away that it was indeed possible that they did not know about the bait. Roy and I conferred and elected to let them go. We had all the paperwork and the evidence regarding the first two, so we went on our way. The next morning I filed the citations at Patty's office. To say we threw a rock in the local law enforcement pond would have been an understatement. The guy in the full orange jumpsuit was a state trooper. The landowner was the business partner of one of the game commissioners. My phone got really quiet. You see, we had a salaried officer in the county now. He transferred up from the Southeast Division. We were not to go to his house, call him, or contact him unless he was working. He never told us when that was. So having been in charge for 3 years, we continued on as usual. That meant that prior to a hearing, the officers involved would meet with me and we would dot all the I's and cross all the T's, and I would formulate how we would approach the hearing, as I would act as prosecutor on behalf of the state. I would go in with all the questions I would ask the deputies as well as the defendants. Trying to outsmart the lawyers was always an interesting challenge. Our boss came to the house about 45 minutes before the hearing and started to tell me how it was to be handled. He didn't want anything to do with it up to that point. I told him the planning was already done and I was ready to go for it. The trooper testified that he knew nothing about the bait until he arrived at the pile with the landowner. We arrived shortly thereafter. He was found not guilty. That was really good for him because he faced double jeopardy if found guilty. As I came to understand, he would receive a file entry that would prevent him from ever being promoted during the remainder of his career as a trooper. The landowner wasn't so lucky. The judge questioned him about the large amounts of chocolate and syrup and how he came into possession of it. He was found guilty. This last case I was not involved with, as I was working day shift at the plant. When I got home, Ed from Bradford County was there. He wanted to know where I was. Dallas was calling for me on the phone and the radio all day. He and Barry, the salaried officer from Sullivan County, got called in to handle it. On top of Dutch Mountain, occupants of a cabin were observed shooting a bear over a pile of corn. They were observed by a PennDOT crew clearing a culvert on the road within sight of the cabin. They radioed Wyoming County Comm Center. In turn, they called Dallas, who took it from there. This bear shooting was a darn shame. You see, it was April, not November. Who the heck baits a bear in April in Pennsylvania? On top of that, the bear weighed over 800 pounds. Bears usually lose an average of a third of their weight over hibernation. When this bear went to den, it weighed over 1,000 pounds. It would have definitely been a Pennsylvania state record, and maybe even a North American black bear record. But since it was killed illegally, it could not be counted. This bear was so big, the officers had to dress it and cut the carcass in half to haul it out. Well, folks, that ends my collage of big game baiting stories. And as usual, I wish everyone all the best.